left off in our last video talking about Mr. Ottaway and Mr. Weil. I was pronouncing it Will in the last video, and it was brought to my attention that it should be Weil with the long I. So I'll refer to him by his correct name in this video, Louis Weil. We talked about how Mr. Ottaway and Mr. Weil were business partners and friends, but also neighbors. He just lived kitty corner from the Ottaways, Mr. Weil did, in this home right here that you can see with the tower on it. Later on, he would move to this home here in the 2600 block of Military Street. A much nicer home, really, a larger home. And of course, these homes on each side of it wouldn't have been there then. It'd probably been all lawn, so I imagine it was quite nice. This is the home he stayed at most in the winter time, but in the summertime, he had a home up on Lakeshore Road. And we'll talk more about that home in just a moment. Weil was born in Brooklyn, New York, and came to Port Huron as a child with his family. He was the editor of the Tatler, which was the first school newspaper in Port Huron High, where he graduated in 1896. 2 years later, he was working as a police reporter at the Detroit Free Press. He was also an enthusiastic promoter of Port Huron. In 1913, Weil led a public campaign to buy the old engine and thresher complex as a site for Grand Trunk's car shops. This has been shortly after the car shops burned. The successful effort kept hundreds of jobs in the community. Then in 1917, with the United States entering the war in Europe, Weil told Oscar Mueller on the idea of moving his munition factory from Sarnia to the old cast motor truck plant on Lapeer Avenue, where Mueller Brass became a major manufacturer in Port Huron. And once again, his efforts resulted in hundreds of good-paying jobs. Mr. Weil was also a leader in Port Huron civic affairs. He was president of the city's community chest. He was the president of the Port Huron Hospital Board and headed many other community activities. He was also a member of the Maccabees, as well as several clubs, such as the Rotary Club. He was selected to represent Port Huron and St. Clair for the Rotary in the World Convention of the Rotary Club, and that was in Nice, France. Mr. Weil wrote 2 books about his travels, and one of the books he wrote was his travels to this convention in Nice. And he talked all about the cruise and everything that happened on this trip. It's a wonderful book, and it gives us an insight into his life, into the type of person that he was. So often we think of these famous people of Port Huron, whether it be politicians or owners of businesses, and we see portraits in the early 1800s, 1900s. They look so stiff, and we think, oh, it wouldn't be any fun at all to be a friend of. But I think I'd be really happy to call Mr. Weil my friend. I want to just show you some excerpts from this book. Here it is here. Bill Goes Abroad, and We Go Too, by Louis Weil. Well, Bill is his son, and so I thought this was nice. He took his little boy out, and we're seeing this trip through his eyes. But here's a picture of Bill on this trip. Bill's a little older than I thought, which made the title, I thought, a little strange, but it's a very interesting book. And I'm going to share some of these things that I see in this book and that he shared with us. Here's a photograph of Mr. Weil sitting in a chair. He says not Robert Taylor, not even Clark Gable, but it's him. And if you don't know who Robert Taylor or Clark Gable is, then of course you're very young. You're very famous actors. This is the cruise ship that he went on, and like many folks that had never been on a cruise, he didn't know what to expect. And here's what he wrote. Up to now, it has always seemed to me that a man ought to be able to get along fine on one dress shirt and one pair of suspenders. In fact, I've always counted myself as darn lucky having both at the same time. But now comes one Fred Philbrick, a salt tycoon, just returned from a South American voyage, and informing me that with less than a half a dozen dress shirts on a first-class ocean steamship, you might as well stay in your bunk until you get into port. Ye gods, what next? This next excerpt gives you an idea of his relationship with his company and the employees. They obviously threw him a bon voyage party, and here's what he says. Party note to the Times Herald family. You are a great gang, and that bon voyage party just made us all very happy. It was the crowning event of a delightful week. Not many institutions around here can boast of men who have been on the job continuously for 35 or more years and are still going strong, and none can boast of a more loyal and efficient organization. What a kick I get out of the new generation, too. They're clean-cut, frank, and full of energy. The Times Herald will remain young and vigorous and in step with the ever-changing times, so long as we have these splendid youngsters coming along in every department. This is as it should be in a newspaper. We should never grow old and grumpy. We must have youth and vision and the courage and strength to fight for what we think is right. We must always have a deep and underlying sympathy with the worker and never allow ourselves to be muzzled or misled. We have seen the Times Herald family grow year by year, and the way to keep it clean and healthy and growing is to retain, by our acts, the confidence of our readers. I have faith in you, Times Herald family. You're a great gang. This wasn't going to be a direct trip to Nice, France. This was going to be quite a sightseeing trip as well. They stopped in Africa, they stopped in Italy, they stopped in England, Switzerland, and of course France. But they made the rounds and they had quite a trip. Here you can see Blanche, Mrs. Wilde, Lewis's wife, conversing with the milkman. Here's how he describes his trip to Venice. Just imagine, if you can, pulling into the Port Huron tunnel station from Chicago and then stepping off the station platform into a gondola with two boatmen at the oars and being propelled in this way through many canals to the Harrington Hotel. I say imagine it if you can. We could hardly believe it, so unique was the experience. The gondola looks just as you have seen it in pictures. They piled our 6 bags into the bow of the boat. We stepped in and were on our way to the Royal Daniel, our hotel, which was just about as far from the railroad station as the Harrington is from the tunnel. This was a dream come true for the Wildes. He says this, of course I know this will sound silly to those who are seasoned ocean travelers and who think no more of going abroad than they do of taking off for California. But you see, I'm still a country boy raised in the first ward of Port Huron. And until I grew up, I always looked upon Europe as a place where poor, ignorant immigrants came from. Rough-looking men seeking jobs, digging sewers, and that sort of thing, and their women with shawls on their heads and their arms full of crying babies. I can remember as a kid going up to the north end and seeing them herded about like a lot of cattle as they came across on the car ferries from Canada. Europe then seemed to me a good place to stay away from. Well, maybe it is yet, for that matter, but that's another story. As Lewis Wilde approached his last port of call, New York City, and that much closer to home, he said this, having arisen at 6 o'clock this morning, I got up on deck and found Al Smith the only man in sight, with the exception of members of the crew. As we traveled around the broad walk, he confided to me that he, too, felt it impossible to sleep with home so near. He told me about his children and grandchildren, 11 of the latter, and I grabbed the opportunity and told him about mine. He was proud of the fact that one of his grandchildren calls him Pom Pom. One of mine calls me Bompa, so I told him he has nothing on me. Silly, isn't it? Just 2 grandfathers talking about their grandchildren. No high-powered businessmen here. They finally arrived home, and you can see here is quite a home. I think I told you it was on Lakeshore Road, but actually it was on Gratiot, about the 4300 block. And the numbers are a little different today than they were back then, so it's pretty hard to pinpoint it. But you can see this is a great-looking home. And I told you that originally they had a home in Military Inn, had the Lakeshore home. But eventually they just had this Lakeshore home. This is what he said when he came home. We are home, home, home. We are with our families and our relatives and our friends. There was Mary and Ann, two of our granddaughters, and Mary remembered us to our great joy and said, "Hello, Pampa," just as I had told Al Smith she could. You all know how that is, at least every grandpa does. I can't tell you how much good each and every one looks to us. I can't describe to you the joy of a handshake, the delight of an embrace. Bill's friends are here to meet him too, and the old ball game will soon start up again in the backyard, just where it left off 2 months ago, with all the kids in the neighborhood gathered there shouting and yelling and running bases. I love it. To me, it is all part of home sweet home. Joe, the gardener, hastens to tell me that the Batum corn is up in good shape, and he has 3 kinds of potatoes coming along fine. Mary, our maid, proudly displayed our youngest granddaughter, Ann, who grinned at us. Mitzi the cat came in and rubbed against us, and our neighbors hailed us with happy smiles. Oh yes, it's great to be home, much better than going away. Yes, they had a maid and they had a gardener, but I think he was just a regular guy. Mr. Weil passed away in December of 1959. I found this obituary in an out-of-town state paper, and it pretty much talks about his life and what we've been talking about, his different jobs and so forth. But it said that he had been in the hospital since 1953 when he suffered a stroke, and that's quite a while. Also goes on to say about his children. His son William, at that time, was sales manager of the Times Herald radio affiliate in Port Huron, which was WTTH. This is the same son that accompanied them on their trip to Nice. Louis A. Jr. was general manager of Federal Publications and editor of the Lafayette and Marion papers. And F. Granger was the executive vice president of the Times Herald. Many of us remember him from our generation. I learned a lot about Mr. Weil making this video. I learned that he was a very good employer that brought loyalty from his employees. I learned that he was a good family man, a man that loved his family, his children, grandchildren, and his wife. And if you would have read this book like I did, you would also found out that he was a good friend to many people in Port Huron. He was a good community leader. He was an enthusiastic promoter of Port Huron, bringing many jobs into the city. And he was a humble man, a man that thought he could go on a cruise to Europe with one dress shirt and one pair of suspenders.